The morning following Richard Hartwell's death dawned grey and overcast, as if the weather itself had conspired to reflect the village's shock. Inspector Graves had remained at the church hall until nearly 9 o'clock the previous evening, conducting preliminary interviews with the fair's attendees and carefully cataloguing the various cups, saucers and refreshment items that had been present. By 10 o'clock on that bleak Friday morning, he had established himself in the sitting room of the village, his small police station, where Sergeant Matthews had arranged for the key witnesses to be interviewed in strict order of their proximity to Richard at the time of his collapse. The investigation, as these things do, immediately acquired a momentum of its own, and Miss Marple found herself swept up in the general current of village gossip and speculation that flowed through the post office, the village shop and every tea table in Littleworth. She had received a telephone call from her niece, asking if she was quite safe, and another from the vicar's wife, inquiring whether she had observed anything unusual that might be of assistance to the inspector. Miss Marple had responded to both inquiries with her customary politeness, offering nothing of substance but conveying the impression of a harmless, elderly woman whose primary concern was the disruption to the fair's schedule. What she did not mention was the careful mental inventory she had begun constructing, a catalogue of small observations that, while individually insignificant, seemed to accumulate into something rather more interesting when considered as a whole. The first person the inspector had interviewed was Eleanor Hartwell, and word of that interview had reached Miss Marple by mid-morning through the remarkably efficient network of village knowledge that centred on Mrs. Dutton at the grocer's shop. Eleanor had apparently been composed but distant, answering the inspector's questions with the careful precision of someone choosing words, as if selecting items from a catalogue. She had confirmed that her husband had attended the fair of his own volition, that she had not accompanied him there, having spent the morning attending to a village business matter. She had arrived at the fair at approximately 2:50, just 15 minutes before his collapse, and had gone directly to the refreshment table to obtain a cup of tea. She had not seen her husband until he fell. The question of who had prepared the poisoned tea remained frustratingly unanswered. The refreshment table had been staffed by 4 volunteers throughout the afternoon: Mrs. Catherine Thornton, the headmistress of the village primary school, young Jennifer Marchant, whose father owned the hardware shop, Mrs. Dorothy Pembroke, the retired nurse who lived in the cottage near the churchyard, and Michael Ashford, the doctor's son, who was home from university for the autumn term. All 4 had been questioned extensively about the preparation and serving of refreshments, and all had maintained that they had seen nothing suspicious and had prepared tea in the standard manner from a large pot that had been kept warm on a spirit lamp. The tea had been offered freely to anyone who wished it, and Richard had requested a cup, which one of them, and here the accounts became frustratingly vague, had poured and handed to him sometime around 2:45. Miss Marple had observed Richard at approximately that time, standing near the flower arrangements with what appeared to be genuine interest in the display. He had seemed quite animated, in fact, speaking earnestly with James Carver, the village's solicitor's junior partner, about some matter that appeared to be causing him considerable concern. What struck Miss Marple as noteworthy was the intensity of their conversation. The way Richard's usual urbane composure seemed to have fractured into something more urgent and even anxious. When James had departed, Richard had looked around the hall with an expression that suggested he was searching for someone, and it was shortly thereafter that he had claimed his tea. The implications of these observations, which Miss Marple kept carefully to herself, were intriguing. By Friday afternoon, as she sat in her sitting room watching the rain begin to fall in earnest, she had received another visitor, Margaret Norris, a woman approximately her own age who had been Richard's secretary for the past 15 years. Margaret had been at the fair briefly, helping with the needlework display, and had left before the poisoning occurred. Her visit to Miss Marple's cottage seemed on the surface to be merely a social call motivated by the desire to discuss the shocking event with a sympathetic ear. Yet Miss Marple's long years of understanding human nature suggested that Margaret's trembling hands and careful avoidance of direct eye contact indicated something rather more complex than simple shock. Margaret had worked her way through several cups of tea and 2 pieces of cake before finally mentioning, almost in passing, that Richard had seemed particularly troubled lately, that he had taken several telephone calls at the office that had left him agitated and withdrawn. She had also noted, though she appeared reluctant to do so, that Richard had been spending considerable time going through the office's old files, matters involving cases that had concluded years ago. The woman had departed without quite saying what she had come to say, leaving Miss Marple with the distinct impression that Margaret possessed some piece of information that she believed to be significant, but was uncertain whether to divulge. Miss Marple found herself reflecting, as evening settled over the village once more, on the particular vulnerability of small communities to violent crime. The village's apparent peacefulness, the sense of shared history and mutual knowledge that bound its residents together, could itself become a source of motive and opportunity. Richard Hartwell's death had not been the act of a desperate stranger, but almost certainly the calculated action of someone who knew him intimately enough to stand beside him at a public gathering and commit murder with remarkable composure. The question was no longer simply who had poisoned him, but rather what secret or motive had burned so intensely in someone's heart that it had overcome the ordinary human barriers that prevented civilized people from taking another's life. By Saturday morning, Inspector Graves had begun to narrow his focus, and the village hummed with the particular intensity of a community obsessed with its own tragedy. The inspector had officially declared that the poison had been introduced into Richard's tea sometime during the 15-minute window between 2:45 and 3 o'clock, and that whoever had added it must have possessed knowledge of the fair's layout and timing. This last detail had led him to concentrate his investigations on the volunteers who had staffed the refreshment table, and particularly on those who had had direct access to the tea service itself. Miss Marple learned through Mrs. Dutton, who had heard it from her cousin who worked at the vicarage, that the inspector had begun to focus his suspicions on James Carver, the junior solicitor. It seemed that James, in his late 20s and possessed of considerably less polish than his senior partner, had been seen standing near the refreshment table at precisely the time when the poison must have been administered. Moreover, it had come to light through inquiries at the local chemist that James had made a purchase of certain cleaning supplies the previous week, supplies that included materials that could theoretically be used to extract cyanide. The evidence was circumstantial, certainly, but it was enough to give the inspector pause, and enough to set the village's speculation running in a particular direction. Yet Miss Marple, sitting in the back pew of St. Mary's Church on Saturday morning, found herself increasingly troubled by the neat simplicity of this theory. She had known James Carver since he had arrived in the village 3 years prior, a conscientious young man with a struggling marriage and a tendency toward excessive drinking that had become rather more pronounced in recent months. He had worked under Richard's mentorship, certainly, but she had observed no particular animosity between them, and James lacked the sort of cold calculation that poison murder seemed to demand. When James had spoken to Richard at the fair, his anxiety had appeared to stem from professional concern rather than personal malice, and Miss Marple's instinct, honed by decades of observing human nature, suggested that the inspector was pursuing a false scent. The afternoon brought an unexpected development that shifted the trajectory of the investigation in a manner that no one had anticipated. Miss Marple was taking her customary walk through the village lanes when she encountered Eleanor Hartwell, who appeared to have ventured out from her home for the first time since her husband's death. Eleanor looked considerably more composed than she had on the day of the poisoning, though there was something almost theatrical about her composure, as if she were consciously performing the role of the grieving widow for the benefit of anyone who might observe her. She was dressed entirely in black, which struck Miss Marple as somewhat excessive given that Eleanor's marriage had not been entirely happy, a fact that the village had long known through the ordinary channels of small-town gossip. Eleanor greeted Miss Marple with apparent pleasure and suggested that they take tea together at her home, an invitation that Miss Marple accepted with barely concealed interest. At the Georgian Manor, sitting in Eleanor's carefully appointed drawing-room with its expensive furnishings and somewhat austere decor, Miss Marple observed something that the inspector appeared to have overlooked entirely. On the mantelpiece, propped against an ornamental clock, stood a framed photograph of Richard with a woman who was decidedly not Eleanor. The woman in the photograph appeared to be approximately 10 years younger than Eleanor, and her expression suggested a degree of intimacy with Richard that was considerably more than professional. Miss Marple, who had never been one to ask direct questions when observation could serve so much more effectively, simply allowed her gaze to rest on the photograph for a moment, while Eleanor fidgeted with her teacup. Eleanor seemed to follow Miss Marple's line of sight and quickly rose to replace the photograph, face down on the table beside the clock. The gesture was revealing in itself, an almost unconscious admission of something that Eleanor wished to conceal. It was then that Eleanor confessed, haltingly and with obvious reluctance, that Richard had been conducting an affair with a woman named Victoria Crane, who worked in the county offices and whom Richard had met through his legal practice. Eleanor had discovered the relationship approximately 6 months prior, she explained, and had confronted Richard about it. He had promised to end the affair, but Eleanor had discovered only last week that he had broken that promise and that the relationship had recommenced with even greater intensity than before. On the very morning of the fair, Eleanor confessed, she had found a note in Richard's pocket, written in a hand that was unmistakably Victoria's, making arrangements to meet after the fair concluded. Eleanor's voice, as she described this discovery, carried an undertone of something that transcended mere injured pride. There was anger there, certainly, but something else as well. A depth of betrayal that spoke to something more fundamental than simple marital infidelity. When Miss Marple inquired gently whether Eleanor had attended the fair knowing of these arrangements, Eleanor's composure wavered for just a moment, her fingers tightening around her teacup in a gesture that recalled her behavior at the moment of her husband's collapse. Eleanor admitted that she had indeed known, that she had followed Richard to the fair intending to confront him there about Victoria. But upon arriving at the fair, she claimed, she had seen the note still in Richard's pocket and had decided that the matter could wait until they returned home. She had done nothing, she insisted with increasing vehemence, except stand and watch her husband drink his tea. Yet as Miss Marple listened to Eleanor's account, observing the careful construction of her words and the deliberate emphasis she placed on her own innocence, another thought began to crystallize in her mind. Eleanor had mentioned the discovery of the note on the morning of the fair, which meant that Richard's pocket had contained a written communication from Victoria Crane at the very moment he had collapsed. Miss Marple's curious mind immediately wondered what had become of that note, for it certainly was not among the items that Inspector Graves had catalogued from Richard's person. The question of the missing note, combined with everything else she had observed, began to suggest to Miss Marple that the murder investigation might be considerably more complex than anyone, including the inspector, had yet realized. The question of the missing note occupied Miss Marple's thoughts throughout the remainder of Saturday and into Sunday morning, occupying that particular corner of her mind that remained perpetually engaged with the small mysteries that comprised her understanding of human behavior. She had not, of course, mentioned the note to Eleanor, preferring instead to allow the conversation to conclude with expressions of sympathy and the sort of gentle platitudes that had become her trademark. Eleanor had seemed almost relieved when Miss Marple rose to depart, as if the older woman's presence had required a degree of performance that was becoming exhausting. By Sunday afternoon, Miss Marple had arrived at a decision that she recognized, even as she made it, was somewhat unorthodox. She composed a careful letter to Inspector Graves, presenting herself as a helpful citizen who had recalled a detail that might be of significance. In the letter, written in her precise, old-fashioned script, she inquired whether the inspector had recovered a note from Richard's person at the time of his death, and if not, whether he might consider investigating the circumstances surrounding its disappearance. She was careful to word the letter in such a manner that it appeared to be merely a suggestion from a concerned observer, rather than any sort of accusation or definitive statement. The inspector, she suspected, would be the sort of man who resented having investigative suggestions forced upon him by village busybodies, but he would be unable to dismiss the possibility that a piece of evidence had been overlooked entirely. She posted the letter on Monday morning and settled back to wait, a patience that had been born from decades of allowing events to unfold in their own time. Police investigation took on renewed intensity following her letter, though the inspector never acknowledged its receipt or gave any indication of having altered his investigative approach based on its contents. However, by Tuesday morning, Word had begun to circulate through the village that the police had been making inquiries about Victoria Crane, the woman with whom Richard had been involved. Victoria was brought in for questioning, and her interview with Inspector Graves stretched on for considerably longer than those conducted with other witnesses. Miss Marple observed Victoria Crane for the first time on Wednesday morning when the younger woman emerged from the police station looking considerably shaken. Victoria was perhaps 38 years old, attractive in a somewhat calculating manner, and possessed the particular air of controlled sophistication that characterized women who had managed to navigate professional environments dominated by men. She moved through the village with the gait of someone who was deeply aware of being observed, and Miss Marple noted with interest that Victoria's composure seemed to crack slightly whenever she thought no one was watching her. It was on Wednesday afternoon that Margaret Norris appeared at Miss Marple's door for a second visit, and this time her demeanor had altered considerably. Margaret appeared less trembling and uncertain than she had on her first visit, and more possessed of a kind of determined anxiety, as if she had come to a decision that was costing her a great deal. Margaret came directly to the point, settling into Miss Marple's sitting room without accepting the customary offer of tea. She explained that she had been to see the inspector that morning and had provided him with information that she believed to be relevant to the investigation. Specifically, Margaret had confessed that she had not been entirely truthful about Richard's state of mind in recent weeks. Richard had in fact been considerably more troubled than she had initially indicated, and his troubles appeared to be connected to something that had occurred in his past, something that involved a case from his earlier years as a solicitor. Margaret had attempted to discover what this matter might be by examining the files that Richard had been so assiduously reviewing, but she had found nothing of obvious significance. However, Margaret had discovered something else that seemed, to her mind at least, to be rather important. Approximately 3 weeks prior to his death, Richard had received a telephone call at the office from a woman who had refused to give her name. Margaret had overheard fragments of the conversation, enough to determine that the woman was threatening Richard with some form of exposure or revelation unless he agreed to meet with her. Richard had refused to discuss the call with Margaret afterward, but she had observed that he had written down the caller's name on his personal calendar, a name that read simply 5th HC. Miss Marple's interest intensified considerably at this revelation, though she maintained her expression of polite attention. 5th HC could of course refer to Victoria Crane, but it could equally well refer to any number of other individuals, yet Margaret's willingness to divulge this information, combined with her obvious reluctance in doing so, suggested that Margaret herself suspected Victoria of having made the threatening call. When Miss Marple inquired delicately whether Margaret had any sense of what Richard might have been threatened with exposure about, Margaret's face flushed with embarrassment. She admitted that there had been rumors, many years ago, about an impropriety in one of Richard's cases, something involving a client who had been convicted of fraud based on evidence that some had questioned. The case had never been formally reopened, and Richard's professional reputation had remained unblemished. But the whispers had persisted in the village for years, before gradually fading into obscurity. If Victoria Crane had somehow discovered information about this old scandal, Margaret suggested, she might have used it as leverage to compel Richard to continue their affair, or to provide her with money, or some other form of advantage. The possibility of blackmail, Miss Marple reflected as Margaret departed, introduced an entirely new dimension to the crime. A murder motivated by blackmail suggested a desperation that cold-blooded calculation alone could not quite account for. Yet it also suggested that the killer might be someone other than Victoria Crane herself, someone who had discovered that Richard was being blackmailed and had taken drastic steps to preserve what they believed to be his interests or their own. As Miss Marple reviewed the accumulating threads of the investigation in her mind, she found herself increasingly certain that James Carver, for all his apparent anxiety and the suspicious purchases of cleaning supplies, was not the person responsible for Richard's death. The inspector, she suspected, would eventually reach the same conclusion. But by then, the real killer might have taken steps to ensure that crucial evidence remained hidden, or worse, that another innocent person bore the blame for a crime born from far more complex motives than anyone had yet considered. By Thursday morning, the investigation had reached what appeared to be an impasse, and the village had begun to settle into that particular discomfort that accompanies an unsolved crime in a small community. Inspector Graves had apparently concluded that, while Victoria Crane possessed motive and opportunity, the evidence against her remained circumstantial, and he had seemed increasingly frustrated by the absence of any definitive proof that would allow him to move forward with charges. James Carver had been released from suspicion after further inquiries into his whereabouts revealed that he could not possibly have accessed the refreshment table at the precise moment when the poison must have been administered. The cleaning supplies he had purchased proved to be nothing more sinister than items for his home, and his anxiety on the day of the fair had stemmed entirely from a professional disagreement with Richard over a client matter. The absence of progress had begun to wear on the village's collective consciousness, and Miss Marple observed with interest how readily suspicion had begun to shift from one resident to another, how quickly certainty could give way to doubt. It was precisely at this moment of investigative stalemate that an unexpected complication emerged. On Thursday afternoon, Dr. Ashford himself came to Miss Marple's cottage, an event so unprecedented that Miss Marple immediately recognized it as significant. The doctor, a man of approximately 60 years of age, with the careful bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime maintaining professional distance from his patients, seemed visibly agitated. He took the seat that Miss Marple offered him with the air of someone who had finally surrendered to a burden that had become too heavy to carry alone. Dr. Ashford explained, speaking carefully and with evident discomfort, that he had been reviewing the circumstances of Richard's death and had come to a realization that he believed he should share with someone before potentially bringing it to the attention of Inspector Graves. The doctor had attended to Richard in the final moments before his death, and he had observed something at that time that had not seemed immediately significant, but which had NCE acquired new meaning in his mind. Specifically, Dr. Ashford had noticed that Richard's left hand bore what appeared to be fresh abrasions on the knuckles, as if he had recently been engaged in some form of physical altercation. Moreover, the doctor had observed that Richard's clothing bore what appeared to be a small tear near the collar, damage that suggested a struggle of some kind. At the time, Dr. Ashford had attributed these minor injuries to Richard's convulsive movements as the poison had begun to take effect. But upon reflection, he had come to wonder whether Richard might have been engaged in some sort of confrontation with another person shortly before his collapse. Miss Marple's interest intensified considerably at this revelation. The presence of physical evidence suggesting that Richard had struggled with someone introduced an entirely new variable into the equation. If Richard had been in physical contact with someone in the moments before his death, that person would almost certainly bear some mark of the encounter. The inspector, one would think, would have taken note of such a detail during his interviews with the suspects. When Miss Marple inquired delicately whether the inspector had been made aware of these observations, Dr. Ashford admitted that he had mentioned them in passing, but that Inspector Graves had seemed to dismiss them as inconsequential, suggesting that they likely resulted from Richard's death convulsions rather than from any prior altercation. The doctor had accepted this explanation at the time, but had subsequently found himself unable to do so. Miss Marple thanked Dr. Ashford for his candor and promised to give the matter due consideration. After the doctor's departure, she sat alone in her sitting room and allowed her mind to trace through the various strands of evidence that had accumulated. Richard had been poisoned, certain. But he had also apparently been in some form of physical contact with another person in the moments immediately preceding his death. This suggested a confrontation of some kind, perhaps an argument or struggle over something. The missing note from Victoria Crane, combined with this evidence of physical struggle, suggested a scenario quite different from the carefully calculated poisoning that everyone had been assuming. What if, Miss Marple wondered, the poisoning had not been the result of premeditation at all, but rather a desperate act committed in the heat of the moment during some kind of confrontation? What if someone had confronted Richard about something, perhaps the old scandal that Margaret had mentioned, or perhaps something entirely different, and in the course of that confrontation, had introduced poison into his tea, not as part of some elaborate plan, but as an impulsive act of violence. This theory suggested a different sort of killer altogether, someone driven by passion or desperation rather than cold calculation. It also suggested that the killer might be someone whose relationship to Richard was considerably more immediate and personal than Victoria Crane's affair implied. Miss Marple found herself thinking again about Eleanor Hartwell, about the woman's performance of grief and composure, about the way her hands had tightened around her handbag at the moment of Richard's collapse. Eleanor had admitted to knowing about the affair, to knowing about the note, to intending to confront Richard at the fair. Yet Eleanor had claimed to have done nothing more than stand and observe. But what if Eleanor had done considerably more than that? What if Eleanor had confronted Richard, had struggled with him, and in the heat of that struggle, had seized the opportunity to poison him? The missing note made a certain kind of sense in this scenario as well. Eleanor would have every reason to remove Victoria's letter from Richard's pocket, to eliminate evidence of his ongoing infidelity. By Friday morning, Miss Marple had made a decision. She wrote a second letter to Inspector Graves, this time suggesting that he might wish to examine more closely the physical evidence present on Richard's clothing and body at the time of his death, and that he might consider whether Eleanor Hartwell bore any marks or injuries consistent with having engaged in a physical altercation. She worded the letter with her customary care, presenting the suggestion as merely the musings of an elderly observer, rather than anything approaching an accusation. But she was quite certain that she had placed the inspector on the correct path at last, and she waited with interest to see how he would proceed. The weekend passed with the peculiar tension that accompanies the final stages of a criminal investigation, when the machinery of law enforcement has begun to turn in a particular direction, and the village braces itself for the revelations that must inevitably follow. Inspector Graves had not acknowledged Miss Marple's second letter, but by Saturday evening word had begun to circulate through the village's reliable gossip channels that the police had renewed their interest in Eleanor Hartwell. Apparently, during a second, more extensive interview, the inspector had posed questions regarding Eleanor's physical condition on the day of the fair, and Eleanor had become visibly flustered before insisting that she had no injuries of any consequence. However, a careful examination of the clothing Eleanor had worn on the day of the fair had revealed small tears consistent with those found on Richard's garments, and more significantly, Eleanor's arms bore faint bruising that she had attempted to conceal beneath her long sleeves. The evidence, while still circumstantial, had begun to form a more coherent picture. By Monday morning, Eleanor Hartwell had been taken into formal custody on suspicion of murder, and the village had descended into that peculiar state of shock that accompanies the arrest of someone from within one's own community. Eleanor had maintained her innocence throughout her detention, but the physical evidence against her had proven difficult to explain away. The inspector, apparently satisfied that he had identified his culprit, had begun to construct his case for the magistrate. Yet it was precisely at this moment, when the investigation appeared to have reached its conclusion, that Miss Marple found herself seized by a doubt so profound that it compelled her to take an action that was entirely foreign to her nature. On Monday evening she requested an interview with Inspector Graves, a request that the inspector, perhaps out of courtesy to an elderly woman, or perhaps out of a desire to satisfy his own curiosity regarding her involvement in his investigative process, was inclined to grant. Miss Marple presented herself at the police station on Tuesday morning, dressed in her customary black coat and carrying her knitting, an accessory that served both as a genuine comfort and as a subtle reminder of her role as a harmless elderly observer. Inspector Graves received her in his temporary office at the station with barely concealed impatience, a man clearly engaged in the considerable paperwork that attended the preparation of a case for prosecution. Miss Marple began her conversation with careful precision, acknowledging that she understood the inspector's position and that she possessed no formal training in criminal investigation. However, she continued, she had spent a lifetime observing human nature, and there was something about the current state of the investigation that troubled her. She had come to discuss N.O.T. evidence against Eleanor Hartwell, but rather a detail that had struck her as peculiar, and which she felt the inspector might benefit from considering. Specifically, Miss Marple wished to inquire about the manner in which the poison had been administered. She understood that cyanide had been placed in Richard's tea, but she wondered whether the inspector had considered how such a poison might have been introduced into the cup without the person administering it wearing gloves or taking extraordinary precautions to protect themselves from contamination. Cyanide, after all, could be absorbed through the skin, and anyone handling it directly would expose themselves to significant risk. Eleanor Hartwell was a woman of considerable intelligence, Miss Marple suggested, a former headmistress entirely capable of understanding such dangers. Would such a woman, even in the heat of confrontation, have simply sprinkled poison into a cup of tea with her bare hands? The inspector's response was dismissive, suggesting that desperation and passion often overcame such practical concerns, and that Eleanor's failure to protect herself adequately merely demonstrated the impulsive nature of her crime. Yet Miss Marple persisted gently, suggesting that she wondered whether the inspector had examined the hands of those individuals who had been present at the refreshment table. If cyanide had been handled directly, there would certainly be some residue, some chemical evidence that sophisticated testing might reveal. The inspector, visibly irritated by this point, assured her that comprehensive examinations had been conducted and that no such evidence had been discovered on Eleanor's hands. Miss Marple rose to depart, seemingly satisfied, but as she did so, she posed one final question almost as an afterthought. She inquired whether similar examinations had been conducted on the hands of the 4 volunteers who had staffed the refreshment table on the day of the fair. The inspector responded with obvious irritation that of course such examinations had been conducted on James Carver and the others, and that nothing significant had been discovered. Yet as he spoke, Miss Marple observed something in his expression, a fleeting uncertainty that suggested that perhaps all 4 volunteers had not been examined with equal thoroughness. It was Michael Ashford, the doctor's son, who suddenly seemed to occupy a more significant position in the inspector's mind. Miss Marple departed the police station with the sense that she had planted a seed that would, if properly tended, grow into something quite substantial. She had not directly accused anyone, nor had she made any definitive statement about Eleanor's innocence. She had merely suggested, through careful questioning, that there might be aspects of the investigation that warranted closer examination. As she walked through the village toward her cottage, she reflected on the curious nature of assumption. The inspector, like most people, had been inclined to seize upon the most obvious suspect once physical evidence had begun to accumulate. Eleanor's motive was clear. Her opportunity existed, and her bruising suggested a physical altercation. All of these facts were true, but the truth, Miss Marple had learned through decades of observation, was often considerably more complex than the arrangement of facts suggested. There were other truths buried beneath the surface, other motives that had yet to be fully explored, and other secrets that the village harbored that might illuminate the crime in an entirely different light. The investigation took an unexpected turn on Wednesday morning, when Inspector Graves, apparently reconsidering the direction of his inquiries, requested that Michael Ashford submit to a more thorough examination regarding his whereabouts and activities on the day of the fair. Michael, who had maintained an apparent composure throughout the initial questioning, became visibly agitated when confronted with the inspector's renewed interest in his conduct. By Wednesday afternoon, it had emerged that Michael possessed a significant piece of information that he had previously withheld from the police, information that he now felt compelled to reveal in light of Eleanor Hartwell's arrest on charges that he believed to be fundamentally unjust. Michael confessed that he had observed something at the refreshment table on the day of the fair that he had not previously disclosed, a reluctance born from his desire to protect someone whose actions he believed to be motivated by circumstances beyond their control. Specifically, Michael had witnessed his own father, Dr. Ashford, deliberately adding something to Richard's cup of tea at approximately 2:55 on the afternoon of the fair. Michael had not immediately understood what he had observed, but when Richard had subsequently collapsed, the nature of his father's action had become horrifyingly apparent. Michael had said nothing at the time, paralyzed by shock and by the impossible dilemma of whether to betray his father or to allow an innocent woman to bear the blame for a crime she had not committed. The weight of that knowledge, Michael explained, had finally become too great for him to bear. The revelation sent shockwaves through the village, and through the investigation itself. Dr. Ashford, summoned for immediate questioning, initially denied Michael's allegation with vehemence and apparent genuine outrage at the suggestion that he could have committed such a crime. Yet when confronted with his son's testimony, and with the evidence that a more thorough examination of his hands revealed traces of chemical residue consistent with cyanide exposure, Dr. Ashford's composure began to fracture. By Thursday morning, he had confessed to the murder, though his confession came with a complexity of motive and explanation that suggested this crime was far from the simple act of poisoning that it had initially appeared to be. Dr. Ashford revealed, in a statement that was both defiant and deeply sorrowful, that Richard Hartwell had been responsible, through a legal case conducted 30 years prior, for a miscarriage of justice that had destroyed Dr. Ashford's life. The case had involved a young woman named Catherine Pembroke, who had been accused of theft in connection with funds missing from a charitable organization where she had worked as an administrator. Catherine had been convicted based on evidence provided by Richard, then a relatively junior solicitor working on behalf of the accused embezzler who had actually committed the crime. Dr. Ashford, then a young physician with considerable professional promise, had been engaged to Catherine at the time of her conviction. The false conviction had shattered Catherine's life and, by extension, had destroyed Dr. Ashford's own future. Catherine had never recovered from the trauma of her unjust incarceration, and after her release, she had gradually descended into a state of psychological deterioration that had ultimately resulted in her suicide 5 years after her conviction. Dr. Ashford had learned, only recently, that Richard had known at the time of the trial that Catherine was innocent, that he had possessed evidence of the true perpetrator's guilt, but had withheld it in exchange for a substantial payment from the actual thief's family. Richard's action had been motivated by greed and by the desire to establish himself in the community through the success of a high-profile conviction, and Catherine Pembroke had paid the ultimate price for his moral corruption. Miss Marple, learning of these revelations through the village's efficient communication networks, found herself experiencing a complex mixture of emotions. She had been correct in her suspicion that Eleanor was innocent, and her intervention had prevented a grave miscarriage of justice. Yet the truth that had emerged was itself profoundly troubling, a truth that spoke to the hidden costs of Richard's success and the long reach of consequences that extended far beyond the moment of their creation. On Friday afternoon, she received an unexpected visitor in the form of Dorothy Pembroke, the retired nurse who had been one of the 4 volunteers at the refreshment table on the day of the fair. Dorothy had come, she explained, to thank Miss Marple for her role in ensuring that Eleanor had not been unjustly convicted, and to share something that she believed Miss Marple might find illuminating. Dorothy revealed that she was, in fact, Catherine Pembroke's younger sister, and that she had known for some years about the circumstances of Catherine's conviction and the identity of the person responsible for the false evidence that had destroyed her sister's life. She had also known that Dr. Ashford had been harboring a deep resentment toward Richard for decades, and she had suspected that knowledge of the truth about Catherine's conviction might someday provoke him to desperate action. Dorothy had not attempted to prevent the crime, she confessed, nor had she attempted to warn Richard of the danger that he faced. She had simply allowed events to unfold, and when Dr. Ashford had administered the poison, she had witnessed his action without intervening. She had been complicit in the crime through her silence, and yet she felt that Richard had deserved the consequences that had finally caught up with him. Miss Marple listened to Dorothy's confession with the particular understanding that came from decades of observing the complex ways in which communities harbored secrets and justified terrible actions through the logic of historical grievance. She made no moral pronouncements, offered no judgments of right or wrong, but simply sat in quiet acknowledgement of the profound injustice that had driven good people to participate in murder. By the time Eleanor Hartwell was released from custody and Dr. Ashford was formally charged with Richard's death, the village had begun to grapple with the uncomfortable truth that it harbored within itself capacity for violence and moral compromise that its peaceful exterior had successfully concealed. The investigation, technically concluded, had revealed far more about the nature of the community itself than about any single criminal act. The week following Dr. Ashford's arrest saw the village enter a state of profound reflection as if the community had suddenly awakened to the recognition that it harbored depths of darkness that its orderly surface had successfully concealed. The narrative of the crime had shifted dramatically from the initial assumption of a calculated murder to a far more complex understanding of how historical grievance and moral corruption could accumulate across decades before finally erupting into violence. Yet even as the formal investigation concluded and the machinery of the legal system began its slow process of moving toward trial, Miss Marple found herself troubled by a nagging sense that there remained aspects of the crime that had not been fully resolved. She had been correct in identifying Eleanor's innocence and in redirecting the inspector's attention toward Dr. Ashford, but she was increasingly uncertain whether the complete truth had been revealed. The confession of Michael Ashford and the subsequent admission of guilt by his father seemed, on the surface, to provide a comprehensive explanation for Richard's death. Yet Miss Marple's long experience with human nature suggested that confessions, while often containing truth, frequently concealed as much as they revealed. She found herself returning, almost obsessively, to the question of the missing note from Victoria Crane. If Dr. Ashford had poisoned Richard, as he had confessed, then what relevance did Victoria's letter have to the crime? Eleanor had mentioned that she had seen the note in Richard's pocket on the morning of the fair, and Miss Marple was quite certain that Eleanor had not imagined this detail. Yet the note had never been recovered by the police, and neither Dr. Ashford nor anyone else had accounted for its disappearance. On Saturday morning, Miss Marple made a decision that surprised even herself. She requested another interview with Eleanor Hartwell, a request that Eleanor, newly released from custody and attempting to reassemble her life in the wake of her unjust imprisonment, was initially reluctant to grant. However, Eleanor apparently recognized that Miss Marple had played a role in securing her release, and she agreed to receive the older woman at her home on Saturday afternoon. The drawing room at the Georgian Manor seemed somehow diminished in the aftermath of Richard's death, the carefully maintained elegance now appearing almost mournful in its precision. Eleanor, dressed in grey rather than the theatrical black of her grieving performance, appeared considerably more genuine in her emotional state than she had during their previous encounter. Miss Marple began her conversation not with direct accusations, but with observations, a technique that she had refined across her lifetime of investigation. She remarked that Eleanor must have been deeply conflicted during the days of her imprisonment, knowing herself to be innocent while observing the evidence accumulate against her. Eleanor confirmed this, speaking with evident bitterness about the experience of being suspected of a crime she had not committed, about the humiliation of arrest and formal custody. It was during this conversation that Miss Marple posed, almost casually, a question about the note that Eleanor had discovered in Richard's pocket on the morning of the fair. Miss Marple suggested that she wondered what Eleanor had done with that note, whether she had confronted Richard about it at the fair, or whether she had perhaps retained it for future reference. Eleanor's response was revealing in its hesitation. She admitted with evident reluctance that she had indeed removed the note from Richard's pocket during their confrontation at the fair. Eleanor had been so consumed with anger upon discovering the evidence of Richard's continued infidelity that when she had encountered him at the fair, she had demanded that he retrieve the note from his pocket so that she might verify her suspicions. During the brief struggle that had ensued, Eleanor had managed to seize the note and had thrust it into her own handbag. She had not, she insisted, poisoned Richard or taken any action beyond removing the incriminating evidence. The note remained, she confessed, hidden in her handbag, where she had left it in her distress following Richard's collapse. Eleanor retrieved the note from a small drawer in the writing desk and handed it to Miss Marple with trembling fingers. The letter was brief and to the point, a communication from Victoria arranging a meeting with Richard after the fair. But its contents were not what most interested Miss Marple. Rather, it was the handwriting on the envelope that caught her attention. The address was written in what appeared to be Victoria Crane's hand, but the postmark on the envelope indicated that it had been mailed from the county town nearly 2 weeks prior to the day of the fair. This detail, Miss Marple realized, was significant in ways that neither Eleanor nor anyone else appeared to have recognized. If the letter had been mailed 2 weeks earlier, then how had Eleanor discovered it only on the morning of the fair? Unless, of course, The letter had been intercepted and hidden by someone else, someone who had only recently placed it where Eleanor would discover it. Miss Marple's mind began to reconstruct a scenario that was considerably more complex than the one that had been formally acknowledged by the police. The letter from Victoria had been intercepted, almost certainly by someone other than Eleanor, someone who had possessed a reason to want Richard and Eleanor's marriage to deteriorate further, or someone who had wanted to ensure that Eleanor would be motivated to confront Richard on the day of the fair. The timing of the note's discovery was too convenient, too precisely orchestrated to be merely accidental. As Miss Marple departed Eleanor's home with the letter in her possession, she found herself contemplating a possibility that she had not previously considered. Dr. Ashford's confession of poisoning Richard appeared complete and comprehensive, yet it did not account for the carefully orchestrated introduction of the letter into Eleanor's hands. Someone else had been involved in the crime, someone who had worked in concert with Dr. Ashford, or perhaps someone who had manipulated events in ways that remained far from obvious. The question that now occupied Miss Marple's mind with increasing urgency was whether Dr. Ashford had acted alone in his desire for vengeance, or whether he had been influenced, guided, or even manipulated by someone else whose motives and identity remained concealed beneath layers of careful misdirection. Miss Marple's renewed scrutiny of the crime's details led her back to Victoria Crane, the woman whose letter had served as an unwitting catalyst for the confrontation between Richard and Eleanor at the fair. Victoria remained in the village, apparently uncertain whether to flee or to maintain her position, a hesitation that suggested to Miss Marple that Victoria possessed knowledge that extended beyond her role as Richard's lover. On Monday morning, Miss Marple arranged to encounter Victoria at the village post office, a meeting that appeared coincidental to any observer, but which was, in fact, carefully orchestrated. Miss Marple engaged Victoria in seemingly casual conversation about the recent events, expressing sympathy for Victoria's predicament, and offering the sort of gentle observations that had become her trademark. She remarked that Victoria must have been profoundly distressed by Richard's death, particularly given the nature of their relationship and the circumstances surrounding it. Victoria responded with the controlled composure that characterized her public persona, though Miss Marple observed the tightening at the corners of her eyes that suggested the woman was far more emotionally turbulent than her exterior suggested. It was then that Miss Marple posed with apparent innocence a question about the letter. She wondered aloud whether Victoria had been surprised to learn that her correspondence had somehow become known to Eleanor, and whether Victoria had any sense of how Richard's wife had discovered the evidence of their affair. Victoria's response was revealing in its sudden loss of control. She confessed, with evident anger and frustration, that she had never intended for Eleanor to discover the letter, that she had been as shocked as anyone to learn that Eleanor had confronted Richard at the fair about her affair. Moreover, Victoria asserted with considerable vehemence, she had not known that Richard would be present at the fair on the day it occurred, and she certainly had not been anywhere near the refreshment table when he had consumed his poisoned tea. Victoria's indignation at being implicated in the crime, even peripherally, suggested that she was speaking the truth regarding her own innocence in Richard's death. However, Victoria's denial did not address the central question that troubled Miss Marple. How had the letter, which had been posted 2 weeks prior to the fair, come to Eleanor's attention only on the morning of the fair itself? Miss Marple proceeded with careful precision, suggesting that she wondered whether Victoria had perhaps mentioned the affair to someone else, someone who might have intercepted the letter and deliberately ensured that Eleanor would discover it. Victoria's response indicated that she had, in fact, spoken to someone about the affair, someone who had counseled her regarding the wisdom of continuing her relationship with a married man. That someone, Victoria revealed with obvious reluctance, had been Dorothy Pembroke. Victoria had encountered Dorothy at the county offices where both women occasionally conduct business, and they had gradually developed what might loosely be termed a friendship. Victoria had confided in Dorothy about her relationship with Richard, had shared her frustration that Richard seemed unwilling to commit fully to leaving Eleanor, and had expressed her hope that she could somehow compel Richard to take decisive action regarding his marriage. Dorothy had listened to these confidences with what Victoria had interpreted as sympathetic understanding, but Dorothy had also asked detailed questions about the nature of Victoria's affair with Richard, about how long it had been ongoing, and about what evidence of the relationship existed in written or other forms. The letter that Victoria had written to Richard, arranging their meeting after the fair, had been composed at Dorothy's suggestion. Dorothy had actually recommended that Victoria commit the arrangement to writing, had suggested that a written communication might be more effective in demonstrating the seriousness of Victoria's feelings and her expectation that Richard would prioritize their relationship. Victoria had complied with this advice, had written the letter and mailed it, and had thereafter thought nothing more about it until the day of the fair, when she had learned that Richard was dead, and Eleanor had apparently known about the affair all along. Miss Marple thanked Victoria for her candor and departed the post office, with her mind now firmly focused on Dorothy Pembroke. Dorothy, the retired nurse, the sister of the woman whose false conviction had haunted Dr. Ashford for 30 years, now appeared to occupy a position of considerably greater significance in the orchestration of Richard's death than anyone had previously recognized. Dorothy had not merely been a passive witness to Dr. Ashford's crime, she appeared instead to have deliberately engineered the circumstances that would plaque Eleanor in a position of suspected guilt, thereby ensuring that if anything went wrong with Dr. Ashford's plan, Eleanor would serve as the convenient alternative suspect. By manipulating Victoria into writing the letter and ensuring that Eleanor would discover it at precisely the moment when she would be most inclined to confront Richard, Dorothy had created a situation in which Eleanor's actions at the fair would inevitably appear suspicious. The brilliance of the scheme lay in its layered deception. On the surface, it appeared that Eleanor had murdered Richard in a jealous rage. Beneath that surface, Dr. Ashford's confession revealed the true poisoner. Yet beneath even that layer of truth lay Dorothy's careful manipulation of events, her deliberate orchestration of the circumstances that had brought both Eleanor's suspicion and Dr. Ashford's murderous intent to their boiling point at the precise moment and location where Richard's death would occur. Miss Marple realized, with a chill that ran through her despite the mild afternoon, that Dorothy had not been content merely to allow Dr. Ashford to commit his act of vengeance. Dorothy had instead ensured that the crime would be executed in such a manner that it would simultaneously destroy Eleanor's reputation, shatter the village's sense of security, and expose the hidden corruption that Richard had concealed within his respectable exterior. Dorothy had used Richard's death as an instrument of vengeance, not only against the man who had destroyed her sister's life, but also against the community that had allowed that injustice to persist for 3 decades. On Tuesday morning, Miss Marple requested another interview with Inspector Graves, and she came prepared with the evidence and logic that would compel him to recognize that the investigation, despite Dr. Ashford's confession, remained fundamentally incomplete. Inspec. Tor Graves received Miss Marple's request for an interview with considerably less enthusiasm than he had demonstrated during their previous encounter. The investigation, from the official perspective, was essentially concluded. Dr. Ashford had confessed to the murder, Michael Ashford had provided corroborating testimony, and the case was proceeding toward what appeared to be a straightforward prosecution. The inspector seemed to view Miss Marple's continued involvement with something approaching irritation, regarding her as a well-meaning but ultimately complicating factor in an otherwise clear-cut matter. However, the inspector's professional obligation to hear new evidence compelled him to grant the interview, and Miss Marple presented herself at the police station on Tuesday morning with Victoria Crane's letter carefully preserved and her observations meticulously organized. Miss Marple began by presenting the letter and pointing out the discrepancy between its postmark date and Eleanor's discovery of it on the morning of the fair. She then walked the inspector through her reasoning regarding Dorothy Pembroke's involvement in orchestrating the circumstances that had led to Richard's death, demonstrating how Dorothy had deliberately manipulated Victoria into writing the letter and ensuring that Eleanor would discover it at precisely the moment when Eleanor would be most inclined to confront Richard. The inspector's resistance to this interpretation was initially pronounced. He argued that while Dorothy's actions regarding the letter might be questionable, they did not constitute evidence of complicity in the actual poisoning. Dorothy had not administered the poison, had not been present at the refreshment table, and had not possessed the specialized knowledge required to obtain cyanide and introduce it into Richard's tea. Miss Marple countered that Dorothy's involvement was not primarily about the poisoning itself, but rather about the careful construction of circumstances that would ensure the crime would occur precisely as it did. Dorothy had known that Dr. Ashford harbored murderous thoughts regarding Richard. She had possessed knowledge of the old scandal that had motivated Dr. Ashford's decades-long resentment. Dorothy had used that knowledge deliberately, had engineered a situation in which Eleanor would have clear motive and opportunity to commit murder, and had thereby ensured that if anything went wrong with Dr. Ashford's plan, the investigation would naturally focus on Eleanor rather than on Dorothy, or on anyone connected to Catherine Pembroke's case. The inspector, gradually recognizing the logical force of Miss Marple's argument, agreed to conduct a more thorough examination of Dorothy's relationship to Victoria Crane and of the circumstances surrounding the letter's composition and delivery. Within hours, new questions began to emerge regarding Dorothy's conduct in the days preceding Richard's death. Investigators discovered that Dorothy had made a visit to the county offices on the morning of the fair, a visit that had coincided with the arrival of the post. Moreover, she had apparently spent considerable time at the main desk area where mail was routinely collected and distributed. It was entirely plausible that Dorothy had intercepted Victoria's letter when it arrived at the offices, had retained it until the morning of the fair, and had then deliberately ensured that Eleanor would discover it in Richard's pocket. By Wednesday morning, Dorothy had been brought in for questioning, and the carefully controlled exterior that she had maintained throughout the investigation began to show signs of fracturing. When confronted with the evidence regarding her manipulation of Victoria and her interception of the letter, Dorothy initially denied all involvement. However, when the inspector pointed out that she had been present at the refreshment table on the day of the fair and had possessed considerable opportunity to observe Dr. Ashford's actions, Dorothy's composure began to deteriorate. Under sustained questioning, Dorothy eventually admitted that she had known of Dr. Ashford's intentions regarding Richard. She had not, she insisted, encouraged him to commit murder. But she had known that he harbored such thoughts, and she had deliberately created circumstances that would ensure that if he acted on those thoughts, the crime would have maximum impact and maximum complication. She had ensured that Eleanor would confront Richard, thereby placing Eleanor in a position of obvious suspicion. She had orchestrated events in such a manner that the village's respectable facade would be shattered, that the hidden currents of resentment and injustice that flowed beneath Littleworth's peaceful surface would be exposed for all to see. Dorothy's confession, while not explicitly admitting to complicity in the actual poisoning, revealed a mind deeply committed to vengeance and to the destruction of the structures that had allowed Richard's corruption to persist unchallenged for 3 decades. As Miss Marple listened to Dorothy's bitter assertions regarding Richard's guilt and the justice of his death, she found herself contemplating the complex moral terrain upon which the crime had been constructed. Dorothy had committed no act of violence herself. She had poisoned no one. Yet her careful manipulation of events, her deliberate engineering of circumstances designed to maximize suffering and chaos, suggested a cruelty that was perhaps more calculated and more fundamentally damaging than the impulsive act of poisoning that Dr. Ashford had committed. Dorothy had not merely sought to kill Richard, she had sought to destroy the community that had harbored him, to expose its hypocrisy, and to demonstrate that beneath its orderly surface lay currents of hidden resentment and buried injustice. By Thursday morning, the investigation had taken on an entirely new dimension. While Dr. Ashford remained the primary suspect in Richard's death, Dorothy Pembroke now faced charges related to conspiracy to commit murder, manipulation of evidence, and deliberate obstruction of the investigation. The case, which had initially appeared straightforward, had revealed itself to be a complex web of historical grievance, carefully calculated manipulation, and competing desires for justice and vengeance. Miss Marple, observing the developments with her characteristic mixture of sadness and understanding, recognized that the village had been forced to confront not only the fact of Richard's corruption, but also the reality that seeking justice for historical wrongs could itself become corrupted into something far darker and more destructive than simple truth-seeking. The crime's resolution, when it finally came, would illuminate not only the mechanics of murder, but the profound complexities of human motivation and the terrible price exacted by the perpetuation of injustice across generations. The formal proceedings against Dr. Ashford and Dorothy Pembroke occupied the village's collective consciousness throughout the following weeks, consuming conversation at tea tables and in the post office with the intensity that only genuine scandal could provoke. Yet, as the machinery of the legal system moved forward with its deliberate pace, Miss Marple found herself increasingly withdrawn from the public aspects of the case, preferring instead to sit quietly in her cottage with her knitting and her thoughts. She had accomplished what she set out to do. She had ensured that Eleanor Hartwell was not unjust. Lie convicted, she had identified the true perpetrator of Richard's death, and she had exposed the careful manipulation that had driven the crime. Yet the satisfaction that such accomplishments might ordinarily have brought was tempered by a profound sadness regarding the human capacity for cruelty disguised as justice. On a grey afternoon 2 weeks after Dorothy's arrest, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor in the form of Michael Ashford. The young man appeared considerably older than he had at the time of the fair, as if the burden of his father's crime and his own role in exposing it had aged him beyond his years. He came to thank Miss Marple for her work in uncovering the truth, and to share something that he believed she should know. Michael confessed that his father had, in the days following his arrest, revealed to Michael the full context of his murderous intent. Dr. Ashford had learned of Richard's deliberate concealment of evidence in Catherine Pembroke's case, not through any independent discovery, but through Dorothy Pembroke herself. Dorothy had approached Dr. Ashford approximately 2 months prior to Richard's death and had provided him with documentary evidence that Richard had possessed knowledge of Catherine's innocence and had deliberately withheld that knowledge in exchange for payment. The documents had been discovered by Dorothy in the course of her meticulous examination of Richard's private files, documents that Richard had carelessly retained despite their incriminating nature. Dorothy had presented this evidence to Dr. Ashford not as a gift, but as a carefully calibrated provocation, knowing full well that Dr. Ashford would be unable to resist the impulse to seek vengeance once confronted with definitive proof of Richard's moral corruption. Michael explained that his father had experienced a kind of psychological transformation upon learning the truth about Catherine's case. For 30 years, Dr. Ashford had harbored suspicions and resentments, but he had maintained sufficient distance from the matter to allow his life to proceed with some semblance of normalcy. The discovery of concrete evidence, however, had shattered that fragile psychological equilibrium and had driven Dr. Ashford toward the desperate act that had culminated in Richard's death. Dorothy had, in effect, deliberately unraveled the careful structures that Dr. Ashford had constructed to contain his grief and resentment, and she had done so with full knowledge of the consequences that her actions might provoke. Miss Marple listened to Michael's revelation with the particular understanding that comes from decades of observing how human beings could be manipulated through the careful application of truth and the calculated destruction of comfortable illusions. She recognized that Dorothy's involvement in the crime extended far deeper than the formal charges suggested, that Dorothy had not merely orchestrated circumstances, but had actively engineered the psychological and emotional state that had made Dr. Ashford capable of committing murder. By the time the legal proceedings concluded in late November, the formal narrative of the crime had been established with reasonable certainty. Dr. Ashford had confessed to poisoning Richard, motivated by decades of accumulated resentment over Catherine Pembroke's false conviction. Dorothy Pembroke had been charged with conspiracy to commit murder and with obstruction of justice, her role in deliberately manipulating circumstances and in providing the documentary evidence that had triggered Dr. Ashford's murderous impulse having been thoroughly established. Eleanor Hartwell had been formally exonerated, and had begun the difficult process of reassembling her life in the aftermath of her unjust imprisonment. Enter Victoria Crane had quietly departed the village, apparently having recognized that her continued presence would serve only to perpetuate the scandal that had consumed Littleworth's attention. The village itself had gradually returned to its outward appearance of normalcy, though an undercurrent of unease persisted beneath the surface, a lingering recognition that the peaceful facade that the community had maintained for decades had concealed far darker currents than anyone had previously acknowledged. Miss Marple, on a cold December afternoon, received a final visitor in the form of Inspector Graves. The inspector came not in any official capacity, but rather as a man seeking to understand something that the formal investigation had not quite illuminated. He sat in Miss Marple's sitting room, accepting a cup of tea, and posed a question that had apparently been troubling him since the conclusion of the case. He asked whether Miss Marple believed that Dr. Ashford would have committed murder if Dorothy had not provided him with the evidence regarding Richard's deliberate concealment of evidence in Catherine's case. Miss Marple considered the question carefully before responding, her weathered hands continuing their rhythmic work with the knitting needles. She suggested that she believed Dr. Ashford harbored the capacity for violence throughout the 30 years following Catherine's conviction, that the resentment and grief that her false imprisonment had generated within him had accumulated like poison within his psychological being. However, she continued, capacity and action are not identical phenomena. Dorothy had transformed potential into actuality through her careful manipulation of circumstances and her deliberate provision of information that she knew would be emotionally devastating. Dorothy had made a choice to unravel the structures that contained Dr. Ord's resentment, knowing full well what consequences that unraveling might produce. The crime, Miss Marple suggested, was therefore not merely the act of poisoning, but the entire carefully orchestrated sequence of events that had made that act inevitable. Inspector Graves departed seemingly satisfied, though Miss Marple recognized that his satisfaction was of a limited variety, a recognition of truth that could not quite reconcile itself with the ordinary categories through which human justice was typically administered. As the winter deepened and the village gradually forgot the dramatic events of the autumn, Miss Marple continued her quiet life of observation and reflection. She knitted, she gardened, and she continued to notice the small details of human behavior that revealed the complex truths hidden beneath the orderly surface of village life. The case had been solved, the guilty had been identified and formally charged, and the innocent had been exonerated. Yet Miss Marple understood, as she always had, that truth and justice were not necessarily synonymous, and that sometimes the most important aspects of a crime remained forever beyond the reach of formal resolution. The village of Littleworth would eventually forget Richard Hartwell entirely, would forget that he had ever existed or that his death had shattered the community's carefully maintained illusions regarding its own virtue. But Miss Marple would not forget, for forgetting would represent a failure of understanding, a refusal to acknowledge the profound complexities of human motivation that underlay even the most apparently straightforward events. She settled into her armchair with her knitting, the soft click of needles providing a rhythmic accompaniment to her thoughts, and reflected upon the curious nature of a world in which justice and vengeance so often became indistinguishable, and in which the search for truth inevitably revealed uncomfortable realities about the human capacity for cruelty disguised as righteousness.